In the situation you are in, you cannot do anything else but resist, not retreat a step, and throw into battle every weapon and every fighter you can get. You can only show your troops one path: victory or death. These words from Adolf Hitler are directed at Erwin Rommel, and they resonate in the African desert, where this general commands Nazi troops in a brutal war. An ocean of sand stretches beyond the horizon, and as German soldiers dig in, the roar of enemy artillery returns. The sky lights up with an orange glow as 800 British cannons open fire. A symphony of destruction shakes the earth in North Africa. Nazi troops can no longer withstand another attack, and Rommel requests freedom of action from the Führer's headquarters, stating that the war scenario is probably lost. But Adolf Hitler was not willing to accept defeat. In this new military history video, we'll learn all about the campaign in North Africa during World War II. The challenges of the desert, the most brutal battles, and how their outcome changed the course of the war.
And we got bombarded by artillery and low-flying planes for 3 days. You could hear the bombs approaching one after the next.
Dramatic scenarios like the one this soldier poses have characterized the Second World War since its beginning, on September 1st, 1939. The Great Conflict began after Adolf Hitler's Nazi Germany invaded the territory of Poland, which was only the basis for a later expansion throughout Europe. The Third Reich conquered several countries during 1940, including a power like France, which captured the attention of the entire world. But even though the Führer showed his power in the old continent, not all the aspirations of the Axis were centered there. The main ally of the Germans was Italy, governed by Benito Mussolini, who dreamed of rebuilding a new Roman Empire in the Mediterranean. To do so, he needed to conquer the lands that were under British and French control. The plan had begun in 1935, several years before the war broke out, with the invasion of Ethiopia on the African continent. In addition, the Italians also had colonies in Libya and Somalia. The new objectives included Corsica, Malta, Tunisia, parts of Algeria, an Atlantic port on the Moroccan Sea, and replacing the British in Egypt and Sudan. Although Hitler had no special interest in the territories that Mussolini sought to dominate for his country, he enthusiastically supported the decision because North Africa represented a strategic scenario. Key to controlling the Suez Canal is access to the oil fields of the Middle East. In this way, Italy assumed the responsibility of representing the Axis on African soil, while the Germans did the same in Europe. On September 9, 1940, the fascist army took the most important step of the plan by advancing from Libya to begin its invasion of Egypt, one of the countries controlled by English forces. Mussolini's men had courage and impetus, but unlike the Nazis, they did not have the adequate equipment to sustain a battle and defeat the enemy. In addition, the soldiers lacked good training, and the British troops took advantage of that. On December 8th, after withstanding the initial attack without losing large chunks of territory, British forces launched Operation Compass. Over the first 5 days, a raid was carried out in which Italian camps were attacked with overwhelming results. Thousands of prisoners were captured, while many of Mussolini's fighters made a desperate escape to avoid falling into British clutches.
As the Italian troops were now pushed back, Mussolini's Balkan ambitions fell apart. The Italians were in deep trouble. It left Hitler with a problem. Should he divert troops from elsewhere in Europe to support his most important European ally, or should he abandon Mussolini to his fate?
The decision was not simple. The Germans would benefit from a victory in North Africa, and their unstoppable advance in Europe made it seem that no rival could stop them. However, Adolf Hitler knew that this was a very different theater of operations than the one his soldiers were used to, full of challenges. To begin with, the hostile desert was the greatest adversary for either side. The terrain in that region was a mix of sand dunes, vast rocky plains, and arid land without vegetation cover, which presented a complex scenario at all times. As if that were not enough, the combatants had to face extreme temperatures. During the day, temperatures could exceed 50 degrees Celsius, while at night, the cold was present with the thermometer below 0 degrees. This drastic change affected the health and physical resistance of the soldiers. Sandstorms were also frequent and could last for days, blinding armies, impairing visibility or damaging mechanical equipment by clogging vehicle engines and preventing maintenance. As if that were not enough, waging war in North Africa was synonymous with supply shortages. The remote and desolate nature of the desert prevented access to fuel and ammunition to operate, but also to food and even drinking water. Soldiers had to endure dehydration, as they were sometimes only allowed to drink small amounts of liquid per day. However, after an exhaustive analysis, the Führer determined that he would send help to Mussolini after the failed effort of his men to conquer that key territory.
In February 1941, a junior German general arrived at the Libyan port of Tripoli. Erwin Rommel was one of the rising stars of the German army and had been chosen by Hitler as the man to rescue his Italian ally and retake North Africa for the Axis powers.
The Nazi force under Rommel was called the Afrika Korps, and its mission was to stabilize the battlefront where the Italians had collapsed. As soon as it arrived, it demonstrated its audacity. Although the general had been ordered to adopt a defensive posture, the German decided to take advantage of the element of surprise and launch an offensive against the British army. Although his troops were initially small, he organized a series of rapid attacks using his panzer armored divisions to retake positions lost by Mussolini's men and push his rival to the east.
Some 16,000 men and over 100 tanks had been diverted from the European front. The Axis forces rapidly outnumbered the British troops, depleted by the war in Greece and Crete. Rommel advanced towards the British positions at El Aghela and attacked.
The advance culminated in the capture of Benghazi in Libya. To achieve this, Rommel carried out flanking maneuvers, attacking unexpectedly from areas of the desert that the British considered impassable. This was what disorganized the enemy defenses. In addition, he had employed a reconnaissance tactic, advancing with small detachments to probe the adversary before committing his main forces. In this way, he would ensure that he would not lose men in vain. His unpredictable strategy and ability to explore the opponent's weaknesses soon earned the Nazi general the nickname the Desert Fox. Rommel adopted fast and bold maneuvers, exploiting to the maximum the superiority of German mobile and armored units, such as the Panzers. His first move surprised the British, who had not expected such an immediate offensive. Before long, they were cornered in Egypt, and a new battle began. After advancing eastwards and capturing several key positions, Rommel faced a major obstacle: Tobruk. This was a port fortress defended by British and Australian forces. It was vital to ensure the supply of fuel and other provisions for the Afrika Korps. On the 10th of April 1941, the Germans began the operation that would become known as the Siege of Tobruk. Nazi forces surrounded the site, expecting the defenders to surrender quickly, but they were met with fierce resistance. The siege lasted almost 8 long months, which took a heavy toll on Rommel's men. During this time, the British under General Leslie Morshead managed to withstand the attack and took advantage of the port to receive supplies. However, the Desert Fox would not give up so easily. He launched several direct assaults and used deception tactics, such as creating fake vehicles and simulating troop movements to confuse the defenders. However, despite the partial success of the innovative strategies, German supply lines were increasingly distant, and Rommel suffered from a lack of reinforcements and resources. Despite several attempts to assault Tobruk, he failed to capture it during the siege, which complicated his ability to operate further east. That fortress became a symbol of resistance for the Allies. Soon, the British understood that they had managed to wear down the enemy and decided to respond by launching a counteroffensive that became known as Operation Crusader, in honor of the name of their tanks, which began on November 18, 1941.
Operation Crusader, as it was called, started with a lengthy armored dogfight.
The objective of the British forces was to finally liberate the city of Tobruk and push the Germans westwards. But the task would not be easy, as the Nazis had a great strategist. The mission posed a battle of attrition, and indeed both opponents suffered significant losses of armored units. However, Rommel deployed mobile defense tactics, retreating when outnumbered, but aggressively counterattacking when he saw an opportunity. During the operation, the leader of the Third Reich forces in Afrika also surprised with a bold offensive. He carried out a long-range attack towards the Egyptian border, disconcerting the British. The key to this maneuver was the quality of the German equipment, since the Panzer tanks offered an advantage over their rivals.
They had bigger gun, so they could engage us further away. We were definitely on the losing side from the point of view of tanks.
the Panzer was a better war machine than a Crusader, without a doubt.
The effectiveness of the German armored vehicles was beyond dispute on the battlefield, but the weight of previous battles was felt. Although Rommel and his men were able to inflict serious damage on the British forces, they were finally forced to withdraw from Tobruk in December 1941. The wear and tear suffered by the Afrika Korps was decisive in considering the decision to withdraw. This would produce the first important victory for the British forces in North Africa, giving the Allies a respite. Meanwhile, on the other side, lurked the fear of a coup de grace. Completely weakened, the Germans believed that if the enemy forces decided to carry out a new offensive, it could be lethal. Hitler was enraged when he received this news and decided that it was time to demonstrate the true power of the Nazi army.
Rommel was in danger of being attacked from behind. Over the next few days, the Germans flew in tens of thousands of troops from Europe to save Rommel and shore up the German position in North Africa.
With the reinforcement of new soldiers and equipment, the outlook on the African front changed dramatically for the Third Reich. After reorganizing his forces, Erwin Rommel was ready to launch a new offensive in 1942. The goal was to advance quickly and recapture most of Libya. On the horizon again, Tobruk appeared, but this time it would be different. After a series of mobile battles and lightning attacks led by the Desert Fox, German troops managed to surround the fortress. After just a few days of fighting, on June 21, 1942, the Nazis finally conquered the city. The operation was one of the greatest tactical successes of the Axis in Africa, resulting in the capture of 33,000 Allied prisoners and a large amount of supplies. The fall of Tobruk was a devastating blow to the British, who had not expected to lose the fortress so quickly. It was undoubtedly a testament to Rommel's ability to coordinate motorized and armored forces and execute rapid attacks. After the great achievement, the Nazi general decided to use that momentum in the battle to push the enemy towards Egypt, dangerously close to the Suez Canal, a vital strategic objective. Despite their overwhelming pace, the effort of the opposing troops managed to stop the advance at El Alamein, a critical defensive position for the British west of Alexandria. This Egyptian city was located between the desert and the Qattara barracks, a vast sandy territory impossible to cross with vehicles. This meant that Rommel could not use his usual flanking tactics, as the terrain restricted the movement of his armored forces. Nevertheless, his Afrika Korps launched several attacks against the English defenses that tried to resist by all possible means. Thus, the first battle of El Alamein was unleashed, which began on July 1st, 1942.
Then, we suddenly spotted a Crusader approaching our firing line from the right side. We brought it down when it was around 600 meters away. In the meantime, the colonel was yelling over the radio, "Shoot! Shoot!"
The Allied power was evident, but so was the German sacrifice. Rommel's offensive met with strong resistance and a well-fortified position. the British dug in and used heavy artillery, as well as a new wave of reinforcements. Despite his tactical skills, the Desert Fox failed to break through the rival lines and, in addition, began to suffer serious supply problems again, especially fuel. Finally, on July 27th, the general in charge of the German offensive decided to retreat to reorganize his forces. However, while he was thinking about how to return to combat with a new strategy, the British surprised him by taking the initiative. On October 23, 1942, Rommel watched as the Allied troops launched a major attack with a renewed army that had numerical and material superiority. Known as the Second Battle of El Alamein, this confrontation exploited the logistical weakness of the Afrika Korps to the maximum. The British were brutal and advanced rapidly across the countryside amid intense tank engagements and artillery duels that lasted for several days in the middle of the desert.
They had 5 or 6 times the number of tanks that we did. We were always the underdogs in terms of numbers. The English started their attacks with 300, 400, 500 tanks, while we had only about 50. That was the ratio at the time.
Despite the stark difference in terms of men and resources, Rommel attempted to use his mobile tactics, retreating and counterattacking whenever possible. However, the weight of the Allied forces and the lack of supplies made an effective defense impossible. For the Nazi general, who had gained a great reputation for his work in the field of combat, this became a battle of pure survival. The lack of fuel and ammunition soon worsened the situation for the Germans, who could simply limit themselves to fleeing, while Hitler sent the order to fight to the death. At the same time, British firepower continued to thunder through the desert dunes, destroying everything in its path.
British artillery broke up the assault, and the panzers were quickly halted. It was Rommel's last battle in North Africa.
The Desert Fox had demonstrated its ability to use innovative tactics and challenge an enemy that was often better supplied. However, the difficulties of a challenging territory and continued attrition were decisive. The Allies knew how to take advantage of their advantageous position and achieved a key victory. The defeat at El Alamein marked the end of the Axis advance in Africa and the beginning of a retreat that would never stop. But it also had an impact throughout the conflict. Sending German soldiers to these battles relieved the pressure on the Eastern Front, where the Soviets sought to resist the Nazi advance. And that's not all. With the success on African soil, the Allied troops decided to go ahead and launch an invasion of Italy, which began with the landing in Sicily in July 1943. That was the first step in changing the course of World War II, producing a break in German dominance and opening the way to an eventual Nazi defeat. Without a doubt, the battle in North Africa was a relevant element in the conflict. Characterized by the harsh conditions of the desert, intense fighting, and a result that marked a before and after in the development of the conflict. Now, after having learned of this crucial victory of the Allies against the Germans, the time has come to say goodbye. Thank you very much for having accompanied us until the end. We look forward to seeing you in our next military history video.